On the morning of her 31st birthday, Evelyn Carter woke to the quiet certainty that something was wrong. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden dread. Just absence. The Manhattan penthouse was too still. No flowers on the counter. No note. No careless hum from the shower where Richard Hale usually lingered longer than necessary, rehearsing confidence before facing the world. The city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows moved as always, traffic threading Fifth Avenue, horns muted by altitude, but inside the apartment, the air felt staged, like a set waiting for actors who had already left. Evelyn lay still, one hand resting instinctively on her stomach. 7 months pregnant. The baby responded with a soft kick, a private reminder of life continuing regardless of adult failures. She smiled faintly, not from happiness, but habit. For months, she had learned to soften herself before the world noticed her edges. She rose slowly and padded into the kitchen. The cake was there. Perfect. Immaculate. White frosting, gold lettering, 31 thin candles already lit, wax beginning to bend under the heat. A small thing, but it stirred something hopeful despite her better judgment. Richard had remembered. Maybe today would be different. 17 minutes passed. The candles drooped. Wax pooled against marble she had chosen herself, paid for herself, though Richard believed it had been purchased during one of his better quarters. Evelyn watched the flame nearest the edge flicker, then gutter out. That was when Richard entered. Tailored suit. Cufflinks. Phone already in hand, finishing a sentence she couldn't hear. He didn't look at her at first. He crossed the room with the same efficiency he used in boardrooms and investor meetings, set a manila envelope beside the cake, and ended the call. "We need to talk," he said. No greeting. No smile. No glance at the candles still burning. Evelyn's eyes dropped to the envelope before he even slid it closer. Heavy paper. Legal thickness. Her name typed, not handwritten. Divorce papers. He said the words as if reading quarterly projections. Irreconcilable differences. He had filed weeks ago. His tone never shifted when he mentioned the pregnancy. Unfortunate timing, he called it. He would ensure the child was provided for appropriately. Financially. Always financially. Evelyn didn't interrupt. Silence had become her second language. She felt the baby move again, sharper this time, and she pressed her palm more firmly against her belly, grounding herself as Richard continued explaining how he had found happiness elsewhere. How this was best for everyone. How she would understand in time. That was when Lauren Bishop appeared. Barefoot, wrapped in a silk robe Evelyn recognized instantly. His late mother's. The one Evelyn had carefully preserved, stored away with reverence, never daring to wear it herself. Lauren leaned against the doorway like she belonged there, her smile lazy, victorious, practiced. Richard didn't correct her presence, didn't flinch. Lauren laughed softly, eyes flicking to the cake, the envelope, Evelyn's stomach. "Ah," she said, "you still did the birthday thing." The words weren't cruel. They were worse. Casual. Evelyn felt something settle inside her then. Not heartbreak. That had burned out months ago. This was clarity, cold and exact. Richard reached into his briefcase and produced another envelope. Cream-colored. Thick. Embossed in gold. An invitation. He didn't explain why he handed it to her. He didn't need to. 6 weeks from today, the Plaza Hotel. Same ballroom where Evelyn had married him 3 years earlier. Same chandeliers. Same orchestra vendor. The symbolism was deliberate. Precision cruelty. Her hands trembled as she read, though the shaking wasn't grief. It was restraint. The front door burst open before she could speak. Margaret Hale, Richard's sister, swept in like she always did, heels sharp against stone, presence loud enough to fill the room. She took in the scene in seconds and smiled. "Well," she said, "I guess the gold digger finally ran out of luck." She didn't look at Evelyn when she said it. She addressed Richard, then Lauren, embracing her with enthusiasm reserved only for those deemed worthy. Evelyn stood there, pregnant, silent, already erased. What none of them knew What Richard had never thought to question was that 18 months earlier, when his company was 3 weeks from collapse, when banks stopped returning calls and investors quietly exited, $12 million had arrived overnight from an anonymous holding firm. They had called it a miracle. Richard had toasted to his own resilience. Evelyn had stood beside him, invisible, her hand resting on her stomach even then, listening as his assistant thanked a donor whose identity would remain sealed. She said nothing. Now, as Margaret continued speaking, cataloging Evelyn's supposed failures, celebrating her removal, Evelyn felt the final layer of illusion fall away. Love had not failed her. Respect had never existed. She looked once more at the melting cake, at the extinguished candles, at the envelope that had ended her marriage on her birthday. And for the first time since Richard had walked in, Evelyn smiled. Not because she had lost, but because she finally understood what this was going to cost them, and how long she was willing to wait. The divorce finalized in 21 days. People later assumed it was because Richard Hale had power, influence, the kind of attorneys who return calls at midnight and billed without blinking. That was true, but incomplete. The speed had less to do with Richard's dominance and more to do with Evelyn's silence. She contested nothing. She signed where indicated, initialed without comment, accepted a settlement that Richard's lawyers described as generous, though the number barely registered against what she actually owned. She let them believe she was exhausted, overwhelmed, eager to disappear quietly with dignity intact. That illusion mattered. Within 72 hours, Evelyn moved out of the penthouse Richard still believed he owned. She took only personal items, clothes, a single framed photograph of her parents, medical records. Everything else remained staged exactly as before, as if she had never truly occupied the space. Her new residence sat 4 blocks east, a limestone townhouse tucked into the Upper East Side, understated by design. No visible security, no ostentation. Purchased years earlier through a holding company whose name had never appeared on any document Richard had signed. Evelyn chose it precisely because it looked like restraint rather than retreat. The first night there, alone, she stood in the nursery room and let herself sit on the floor. Not to cry, to remember. 18 months earlier, in this same city, she had stood barefoot in the bedroom of that penthouse while Richard paced on the phone. His voice had cracked then, just slightly. He thought she hadn't noticed. The company was weeks from default. Payroll threatened. Creditors restless. He spoke in fragments, never saying the word failure, as if naming it might summon it. Evelyn had listened quietly, hands folded, already calculating. She had made the transfer that night. $12 million, wired through Morrison Financial Group, one of several entities her family office used for quiet acquisitions. The funds landed exactly where Richard's CFO needed them. No explanation, no conditions, only discretion. The next morning, Richard had been radiant. He had lifted her off the ground in relief, laughing, calling it fate. A miracle. He never once asked where it came from. He never once wondered if the woman beside him might be more than what he assumed. Evelyn returned to the present and stood. The weeks that followed were meticulous. She met with Patricia Chun, her lead counsel, in a private office overlooking Bryant Park. Patricia listened without interruption as Evelyn outlined what had happened. The birthday, the divorce, the invitation, the insult delivered with precision. Patricia asked only one question. "Are you sure?" Evelyn rested a hand on her stomach. The baby shifted, slow and strong. Yes. There would be no confrontation, no threats, no preemptive strike, only documentation. They assembled everything. Transfer records, ownership structures, shareholder agreements, emails, board minutes. Each piece verified, stamped, and prepared to withstand hostile scrutiny. Patricia moved efficiently, professionally, without moral commentary. She understood that this was not about revenge. It was about truth introduced at the correct moment. In public. Meanwhile, Richard moved forward with confidence. The wedding planning was extravagant and conspicuous. The Plaza Ballroom booked without hesitation. Invitations sent to partners, politicians, media figures. A celebration meant to signal success, renewal, elevation. Lauren appeared everywhere on his arm, performing belonging with theatrical ease. Richard told people Evelyn had taken the divorce well, that she was emotional, but reasonable, that she understood their worlds had simply diverged. No one contradicted him. That silence traveled. Evelyn watched from a distance she controlled. She declined events politely, returned messages selectively. She let people believe she was retreating into privacy, into motherhood, into irrelevance. That assumption was useful. 2 weeks before the wedding, she commissioned a midnight blue Rolls-Royce Phantom. Custom interior, subtle detailing, not new money loud, old certainty quiet. She instructed delivery for the exact moment she needed, down to the minute. Timing mattered. On the morning of the wedding, Evelyn dressed slowly. The emerald gown had been tailored to honor her pregnancy rather than conceal it. No apology in the cut. No attempt to minimize presence. She chose jewelry inherited, not purchased. Objects with weight. Across the street from the plaza, she watched the ceremony begin through sheer curtains. Richard stood tall, Lauren radiant. Applause followed vows that echoed promises Evelyn remembered once believing. The orchestra swelled. Champagne flowed. Guests relaxed into celebration. That was when she waited. 15 minutes after the vows concluded, Evelyn nodded to her driver. The engine turned, and as the Rolls-Royce pulled into the circular drive, heads began to turn. Not yet in recognition, but in attention, which was exactly how it needed to start. The moment Evelyn stepped out of the car, the room began to fracture. It wasn't loud at first. No gasps. No shouting. Just a subtle shift in gravity. The kind that pulls conversations inward and forces attention without asking permission. The afternoon sun caught the emerald silk of her gown, the fabric moving with her rather than around her, and for a second the entire entrance seemed to hold its breath. She paused deliberately, not to look around, not to search for anyone's reaction. She allowed the silence to settle on its own, the way she had learned to let other people's discomfort do the work for her. Inside the ballroom, applause faltered. Glasses hovered midair. A violinist missed a beat. Richard saw her then. The color drained from his face so quickly it startled the man standing beside him. His hand tightened reflexively around Lauren's waist, not in affection, but in panic. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. He had always been good with words when he believed he was in control. This was different. Lauren turned next. Her expression moved through confusion, irritation, then something sharper. Calculation. She leaned closer to Richard, whispering something Evelyn could not hear, but she recognized the posture. It was the same one she had used herself once. Defensive. Clinging. Evelyn entered the room. Each step was measured. Unhurried. The documents rested lightly against her side, a slim folder that looked almost insignificant against the spectacle surrounding it. She did not skin faces. She did not smile. She walked as if she belonged there, because she did. Someone whispered her name. Then another. Recognition rippled outward, uneven but accelerating. People she had dined with. Smiled for. People who had sent sympathetic texts after the divorce and RSVP'd yes to this wedding in the same breath. Their eyes followed her now, not with warmth, but with something closer to self-assessment. Richard recovered enough to move. "This is inappropriate," he said, his voice louder than necessary, pitched to command rather than persuade. He stepped toward her, one hand raised slightly, as if to usher her back toward the door. "You need to leave." Evelyn stopped. She did not look at him immediately. She adjusted her grip on the folder instead, a small movement that grounded her. Then she met his eyes. "You invited me," she said calmly. The words landed harder than any accusation. Before he could respond, Victoria Hale pushed through the crowd. Richard's sister had always moved like she owned every room she entered, but now there was tension in her stride, anger sharpened by embarrassment. She took in Evelyn's presence in a single glance and sneered. Of course she came, Victoria said, loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. I guess humiliation is a hobby now. Evelyn said nothing. Victoria stepped closer. Too close. The distance collapsed suddenly, violently. Words spilled from her mouth, familiar ones. Gold digger. Manipulator. Drama seeker. Each insult thrown with the confidence of someone who believed there would be no consequences. Then it happened. Victoria spat. It was quick. Instinctive. A small, ugly arc that landed against Evelyn's cheek and slid downward, leaving a visible trail in the light. A sound cut through the room, sharp and collective. Shock made audible. 300 people saw it. At least a dozen phones lifted instinctively. Time slowed. Evelyn did not flinch. She did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She reached into her clutch, withdrew a silk handkerchief, and wiped her face with deliberate care. Her eyes never left Victoria's. The silence that followed was absolute. Security began to move, but Evelyn raised one finger slightly. Not a command. A suggestion. They stopped. She turned then, not to Richard, but to the room. I wasn't going to speak, she said evenly. But since we're all here, I think it's time the truth stopped being private. Richard lunged forward. This is insane, he snapped. You're embarrassing yourself. Evelyn opened the folder. The first document slid free smoothly. A bank transfer receipt. $12 million. Dated 18 months prior. The header bore the seal of Morrison Financial Group. She held it up. This saved Hale Technologies from bankruptcy, she said. 3 weeks before default. Richard froze. Murmurs spread, fast and uncontrolled. Someone said his name. Someone else said the word bankruptcy aloud, incredulous. Evelyn did not pause. The second document followed. Corporate ownership records. Shareholder percentages. Names. Structures. Morrison Financial Group owns 62% of Hale Technologies, she continued. Which means the company celebrating today is not his. Lauren's breath hitched audibly. Richard shook his head. That's not possible. It is, Evelyn replied. Because Morrison Financial Group belongs to me. The room erupted. Voices layered. Phones fully raised now. A few guests stepped back instinctively, already distancing themselves from the wreckage forming at the center. Richard stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Fear replaced arrogance. Real fear. You never told me, he whispered. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. You never asked. Victoria screamed something incoherent and tried to surge forward again, but security moved decisively this time, pulling her back as she thrashed. Evelyn slid the final document into view. Emails. Board minutes. Proof of deliberate ignorance. I protected your pride, she said. You mistook that for weakness. She closed the folder. The damage was already done. Outside, sirens wailed faintly, unrelated and distant. Inside, the wedding collapsed in real time. Guests began to leave. Calls were made. Calculations recalculated. Evelyn turned away before anyone could speak again. As she walked back toward the exit, she felt her daughter move, strong and insistent. And for the first time that day, the silence behind her felt earned. Richard did not follow her immediately. That detail mattered. The room had turned hostile to him in a way no confrontation ever could. The applause that had once belonged to him had evaporated into whispers, and whispers hardened quickly into distance. Men who had called him brother stepped back as if reputation were contagious. Women who had praised Lauren's dress avoided eye contact entirely. The orchestra never resumed. Lauren stood frozen near the cake, mascara beginning to smudge as reality worked its way through denial. She kept asking Richard questions he did not answer. Her hand tugged at his sleeve once. Then again, each attempt smaller than the last. He shrugged her off without realizing he had done it. Across the room, Victoria's voice rose again, furious and shrill, until security pulled her fully away. She screamed about lawsuits and slander, about how this would be fixed. No one listened. The phones pointed in her direction did not lower. Richard finally moved when one of his board members approached him. Not to help, to assess. The man leaned in close, spoke quietly, and stepped away without waiting for a response. Richard watched him go with a look that said he understood something essential had shifted. Power was no longer where he thought it was. It had never been. He found Evelyn in the corridor outside the ballroom. Near the grand staircase she had descended on her wedding day 3 years earlier. She stood alone now, one hand on the railing, breathing evenly. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice stripped of command, reduced to something almost small. Evelyn did not turn. "Because love that requires proof isn't love," she said. "And respect that depends on fear isn't respect." He swallowed. "I would have stayed." "That's not comforting," she replied. A flash of the past surfaced then, uninvited. Richard remembered standing in that same hallway years ago, laughing with friends while Evelyn waited for him inside. Patient, invisible. He had not been cruel in that moment. Just careless. He had always mistaken the two. "I made a mistake," he said. Evelyn faced him now, not with anger, with assessment. "No," she said calmly. "You revealed yourself." Inside the ballroom, the fallout accelerated. Lauren tried to rally support, smiling through tears, insisting there had been a misunderstanding. But misunderstanding does not survive documentation. People excused themselves politely and left. Some avoided Richard entirely. Others shook his hand with the stiff courtesy reserved for someone whose future is no longer relevant. Phones buzzed across the city. Video of the incident spread before the cake was cut. Headlines began drafting themselves. The phrase "pregnant ex-wife" appeared more than once. Stocks moved faster than apologies ever could. Hale Technologies dropped 23% in after-hours trading. By the time Richard checked his phone, the board had scheduled an emergency meeting. Without him, Evelyn watched none of it. She returned to the car and instructed the driver to take her home. Not the townhouse. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere she had already chosen weeks earlier. A place with light and trees and no memory of Richard's voice. As the city slid past the window, her mind returned briefly to another moment. A night years ago, when Richard had come home late, frustrated, talking endlessly about how no one saw his vision. Evelyn had listened then, rubbing his shoulders, reassuring him he was capable. She had believed it. She had believed in him. That belief had been her first mistake. The second had been thinking she needed to be seen to matter. At home, she changed slowly and sat on the edge of the bed, one hand resting over the steady rhythm inside her. The baby responded, grounding her again in the present, in what remained untouched by any of this. Patricia called an hour later. "It's done," she said simply. "They want to talk." "Not tonight," Evelyn replied. She turned her phone off after that. Richard spent the night fielding calls that offered sympathy without solutions. Lauren left the hotel alone, still in her wedding dress, photographed by someone who had once congratulated her. Victoria was escorted home by security and a reputation she could not outrun. None of it required Evelyn's attention. By morning, the narrative had solidified. Richard Hale was no longer a visionary. He was a beneficiary who had mistaken anonymity for irrelevance, a man who had confused patience for power. Evelyn woke early, calm, and made coffee. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, she planned nothing. For the first time in months, there was nothing left to prepare. Only life to continue building. Morning arrived without ceremony. Evelyn woke before sunrise in the quiet rental overlooking the Hudson, the kind of place people used when they needed space rather than escape. Light filtered through sheer curtains, soft and colorless, and for a few seconds she forgot everything except the steady rhythm beneath her hand. The baby kicked once, then again, as if confirming that whatever had ended the night before had not touched what mattered most. She rose slowly and moved through the kitchen, brewing coffee she barely tasted. Her phone remained off. Silence was not avoidance. It was selection. By mid-morning, the world had caught up. Patricia arrived first, her expression controlled but alert. She set her tablet on the table without sitting. The board voted, she said. Unanimous. Richard is out. Effective immediately. Evelyn nodded once. No satisfaction. Just acknowledgement. They want to negotiate. Patricia continued. Buyback options. Damage control. They are trying to stop the bleeding. Evelyn looked out at the river. Barges moved steadily through the water, indifferent to scandal. We are not negotiating, she said. We are stabilizing. Patricia smiled then. Not as a lawyer. As a witness. By noon, the narrative had evolved. Commentators dissected footage frame by frame. Headlines debated power dynamics and public accountability. Some framed Evelyn as ruthless. Others called her restrained. No one questioned the documents. That part mattered. Hale Technologies entered freefall. Clients paused contracts. Partners requested distance. People who once praised Richard's leadership began revising history, insisting they had always harbored doubts. Reputation collapsed faster than stock value. Lauren filed for annulment before the day ended. The filing cited misrepresentation. Evelyn read the alert without reaction. She felt no triumph. The arc had completed itself without her interference. Lies had simply encountered light. That afternoon, a flashback surfaced uninvited. She remembered sitting across from Richard years ago in a small restaurant downtown, the kind without reservation lists or pretension. He had spoken passionately about building something that mattered, about legacy, about not becoming like the men who had dismissed him early in his career. She had listened, believed, invested, not just money, trust. That memory dissolved as easily as it arrived. By evening, Patricia returned with finalized documents. Operational authority transferred. Executive access revoked. The company would be restructured under a new name within weeks. Morrison Group would assume control quietly. No press conference. No announcement. Stability required discretion. Evelyn signed where needed and closed the folder. Outside, the city prepared for night. Inside, she felt lighter than she had in years. Richard called once. She did not answer. He texted later. Long messages. Apologies tangled with regret and nostalgia. Promises of therapy, of growth, of understanding. She read none of it. The relationship had not ended because of one betrayal. It had ended because of a pattern finally revealed. Victoria attempted contact through an intermediary. The message suggested reflection, growth, a desire to apologize. Evelyn declined politely. Forgiveness did not require proximity. That night, Evelyn stood in the nursery of the townhouse she would soon return to. The walls were still bare. No theme, no rush. She pressed her palm to her stomach and spoke quietly, promises meant for one listener only. About strength without cruelty. About patience without silence. About dignity that did not need witnesses. The city outside glowed with thousands of windows, each holding someone else's unfinished story. Evelyn felt no urge to look back toward the plaza, toward the ballroom where everything had broken open. She had not destroyed anything. She had revealed it. Late that night, when exhaustion finally settled in, Evelyn lay down and allowed herself one final thought about Richard. Not anger, not sorrow, just clarity. He had never been the architect of his own success, and she had never been as small as he needed her to be. Sleep came easily after that. Tomorrow would bring responsibility, decisions, motherhood, but tonight belonged to quiet. And for the first time in a long while, quiet felt like power. 3 years later, the story still surfaced in fragments. Not because Evelyn revisited it, but because other people did. Occasionally at charity dinners, someone would hesitate before introducing themselves, eyes flicking with recognition they tried to disguise. Sometimes it was subtler, a pause in conversation when her name appeared on a seating chart, a recalibration that happened quietly and without comment. She no longer corrected assumptions. Her life had moved forward in ways that did not require explanation. Isabella was too now. Curious. Unafraid. She had inherited Evelyn's calm and none of Richard's impatience. Mornings were structured around small rituals: breakfast at the kitchen island, sunlight warming the hardwood, tiny fingers tracing condensation on glass. The townhouse felt lived in now. Toys in corners. Books stacked where they had been read, not arranged. Morrison Technologies had stabilized and then grown, not explosively, but deliberately. Evelyn never gave interviews about the restructuring. She declined panels. Let others speak. The company's culture shifted slowly but decisively. Employees stopped bracing for volatility and started building. Productivity rose. Turnover fell. Quiet competence replaced performance. The absence of Richard's name from the company's narrative became permanent. He moved west eventually, a mid-level position at a startup that failed quietly within 18 months. There were no headlines this time, no witnesses, just the slow recalibration of a man learning what he was without borrowed authority. Evelyn learned none of this directly. Information arrived indirectly, diluted by distance and disinterest. It registered without impact and passed through her without leaving residue. That was the difference. One evening, as rain settled over the city in a soft, persistent rhythm, Evelyn stood by the window holding Isabella against her shoulder. The child slept easily, breath warm against her collarbone. Evelyn watched headlights smear across wet pavement below and thought about the woman she had been when all of this began. She remembered the birthday cake, the candles, the envelope. She did not feel anger at the memory. She felt something closer to gratitude. That moment had been brutal, yes, but it had also been precise. It had stripped away illusion without destroying her capacity to build again. That mattered. Patricia stopped by occasionally, no longer just as counsel. They talked about work, about the foundation Evelyn had quietly launched, focused on legal support for women navigating complicated separations without leverage. It operated without branding, without announcements. It simply existed where it was needed. Evelyn believed that was enough. Isabella stirred and murmured something unintelligible. Evelyn smiled and shifted her weight, instinctively protective even now. The future no longer felt like something to be defended. It felt like something to be entered deliberately. She had learned that justice did not require fury to be effective. That restraint, when paired with truth, carried far more weight than spectacle. That power revealed publicly only mattered if it had been built privately first. The city hummed below, indifferent and enduring. Evelyn turned from the window and carried Isabella back to bed. She tucked her in, adjusted the blanket, and paused for a moment longer than necessary, watching the steady rise and fall of her daughter's chest. There would be questions someday. About her father. About the past. About why certain names never appeared in photographs or stories. Evelyn would answer honestly when the time came. Without bitterness. Without erasure. Truth delivered gently was still truth. She turned off the light and closed the door behind her, moving through a home that reflected her choices rather than someone else's expectations. The night settled comfortably around her. What remained of the story others remembered had already done its work. Reputations had fallen. Power had corrected itself. Silence had spoken. Evelyn poured herself a glass of water and stood alone in the kitchen, unhurried, unburdened. There was nothing left to prove, only life to live. And that, she had learned, was the most enduring sentence of all.